police cars, the front seat. And even though police cars are faster, fire trucks are funner to ride in because when people wave at you, they're using all 5 of their fingers, right? I grew up in the home of an emergency services provider. So my dad was a firefighter when I was a little kid. When I was a senior in high school, he turned to the dark side and became a police officer. So I grew up in that lifestyle. And then for the past 23 years, have been working right alongside of all of you in the trenches of trauma out there, responding out to chaplain calls when somebody dies and they request a chaplain to come out. And just as a way of kind of grasping how our program works, last year we responded to 497 chaplain callouts in our response area. I've got a team of chaplains that work for me, which is really great because there's no way I could do any of that by myself. So we got chaplains on the street almost every single day that are working in these situations, and that's been what I've been doing. And so throughout the years of being involved in this, I've learned a lot about life. I've learned a lot about death and a lot about trauma. And a number of years ago, started getting involved with peer support and developing and coordinating and consulting with different peer support teams, and then getting involved in the training aspect of it and different things. And as I worked within that culture and within the peer support stuff and talking about mental health and emotional health and all of those things, I began to notice different trends within how we in first response respond to, work with, deal with, process, particularly trauma. And so we started putting together some of these classes on post-traumatic stress, secondary traumatic stress, and things like that. But the goal was to use words that weren't psychological words, because we know we're talking to first responders, right? So translated a lot of it into first responder speak, so it makes sense to what we're doing. And so the reason the secondary traumatic stress topic came up was because when we respond and we deal with trauma on such an everyday, regular basis, understanding that trauma that we experience isn't ours. It's already happened to somebody else, but why does that impact my world? So started to do a lot of different studies on this, and it's been really interesting. Have you ever heard that statement, not my circus, not my monkeys, right? So when we talk about trauma, we're specifically going to talk about this. It's not my circus, not my monkeys, but why do I hate the monkeys so much? Right? Why does other people's trauma impact and affect our world? How many of you are a part of a peer support team? A few of you? Good. This is going to be some great training for peer support. Because it gives you some tips, some tools on how to do peer support, right? And different things like that. And so, I love it when I'm sitting in some of these classes and the instructor's like, okay, here's what you have to do. You should be doing yoga and journaling and long walks on the beach to make sure you're taking care of your mental health. I'm not going to do that to you tonight. That's not what you're going to hear from me. Because don't picture me in yoga pants, please. Okay. Here's what I truly believe when it comes to dealing with and taking care of us. Each of us has our ability and our own coping skills and what we do to take care of us. And it's different for each and every single one of us, right? For me, it's going to be mountain biking because that's what I love to do. It's not going to be journaling. That's not what I'm going to be able to do because that's just not me. So what is you? You have to do you, and that's going to be really important. So what I'm not going to do tonight is tell you to do that kind of stuff. But what I am going to do is talk about some of the basic principles of that mental emotional health care, particularly around what we call emotional balance when it comes to dealing with the trauma that we're exposed to on a regular basis. And so our goal tonight for class is to talk about indirect trauma. So trauma comes in many different forms, right? And there's a lot of crossover when it comes to trauma and how it impacts our world when we start talking about post-traumatic stress, secondary traumatic stress, vicarious trauma, compassion fatigue, and all of these big words. There's a lot of crossovers. But what we want to do tonight, though, is kind of break that down and directly look at that indirect trauma. So trauma and understanding the nature of trauma is that doesn't matter who you are or how strong your personality is, or how much you've seen in your world. Trauma, just by its very nature, impacts your life. It just does. That's what trauma is. And whether it's insignificant or significant trauma, it still has some form of way of touching your life. So I had a friend of mine that called 911 not too long ago because his daughter's kitty cat was stuck in a tree. And which I still give him crap about that all the time. Really, you called for that, And it's a good thing the cops didn't show up first, because the cops would have said, little girl, have you ever seen the skeleton of a kitty cat in the tree before? Right? But the firefighters showed up, and what did they do? They brought their ladder truck out, put the ladder truck up, saved the little kitty cat, everybody's hero. Was that traumatic for any one of those firefighters, do you think? No, it really wasn't. It really truly wasn't. Was it traumatic for that little girl? Yeah. She's standing there on the sidewalk. She's crying her eyes out because her kitty cat was stuck in that tree. And every single one of those firefighters that were there witnessed and saw that, dropped it in their little bucket, and then continued on to do what they do. And that's the thing with trauma, especially what we're going to be talking tonight. When we talk about secondary traumatic stress, is talking about how other people's trauma impacts our world, whether it's significant or insignificant trauma, it's still trauma. Then we're going to talk about the link between trauma and grief and how that creates an emotional balance. And I have to tell you right now, I almost forgot to do this because it's important. We're going to talk about emotions tonight. And I've learned a long time ago that when you start talking to first responders about emotions, that it's kind of like, it's almost like that eye roll, like, oh my God, we're going to talk about emotions. And yes, I have to use the F word tonight. And I apologize if that offends anybody, especially coming from me. But if we talk about emotions, guys, we have to talk about feelings at some point in time. Right. And so before you kind of like shut that switch and like, oh, we're going to talk about feelings, give me a chance to explain a little bit, right? And especially when we talk about emotions, it's going to be really important because these are key things of what we're talking about, because we're going to talk about emotional balance and this key of having to find a balance within our emotional system and how trauma impacts that system, right? And then purposeful emotional health care. And what that looks like and what we can do and just tips and tools for that. And so that's kind of where we're going to be going tonight, what we're going to be looking at and what we're going to be talking about. So let's talk about trauma, particularly what we call indirect trauma. So like I said, there's different forms of trauma, right? Secondary traumatic stress or secondary trauma can occur when we hear the story or witness trauma that takes place to other people, right? That's what secondary traumatic stress is. And vicarious trauma represents a shift in the attitude or your worldview after being prolonged exposure to that trauma. So we start viewing and looking at the world in a very different way, which we'll explain that. Just to know, post-traumatic stress is a mental health condition that's triggered by a terrifying event. And that's more of the acute type trauma, which we're not going to spend a lot of time on, because here's what I've learned. I have been to, and I have witnessed, and I have seen and experienced, and I bet you everybody here has been to one of those calls that were just really, really bad. And when you walked away from it, you were fine. You were totally okay. You did your job, you did your job well, and you walked away from it and you were good. Anybody have done that before? Right? But at the same time, all of us have been to one of those calls where you walked away from them, you're like, I'm not good. That was horrific, right? When you look at what we do, this is our jobs. This is what we do. It's who we are. It's a calling that we have to be able to respond to emergency type situations, no matter the circumstances and the traumaticness of it, and do a job well. When we start looking at what secondary traumatic stress is, though, and how that impacts our world and how trauma impacts our world, whether you feel it or not, because you experienced it, because you touched it, because you witnessed the impacts of it, right? And it's not necessarily the blood, guts, and gore either that bother us, especially when we're talking about secondary traumatic stress. I have, in my job as a chaplain, I've seen death in every way, shape, manner, or form you can probably imagine over the 23 years that I've been doing this. And I have to honestly tell you, I've never really been bothered by a body. The mechanism of the trauma that's taken place. You know what gets me and what's gotten me over the years? People still living, right? That noise a mama makes after she loses her baby that no other creature on earth makes. And once you hear that noise, you can never, ever unhear that noise, right? Those are the things. And so when I started looking at, and understanding that it really wasn't necessarily bad calls that get us. It's the chronic exposure to trauma on an everyday, regular basis that starts to impact our world and begins to change how we're interacting with the people that are a part of our lives, right? And so that indirect trauma, like I said, not my circus, not my monkey, which means that secondary traumatic stress happens because we've been exposed to somebody else's trauma. So secondary traumatic stress is the emotional duress or that reaction that results when we hear about the firsthand trauma of somebody else. When you look at my little diagram here, you have the first responder and the patient of trauma, all of those things are interconnected. And when you go there and you witness that and you experience it, so that little girl that's standing on the sidewalk, right? Not traumatic experience for a firefighter, none at all. But they witnessed the trauma that that little girl was going through. And they dropped it in their little bucket and they walked away to the next call. And then the same thing happens again because we're connected to that trauma. Flip over to the other side of trauma, the more significant trauma, 13-year-old kid, not getting good grades at school. So his mom and dad decided to take his Xbox away from him. They go to the store, they come back, and he's hanging in the entryway of the house with his dad's tie. So they're doing CPR on him. When I got to the scene, they were still doing CPR on this kid. Dad is at his feet, kneeling at his feet, rubbing his son's ankles, begging his son to live. While the firefighters are they're doing active CPR. And he's there, please live, please live. Mom was in the other room wailing. You think that was traumatic for those firefighters that night? Absolutely, right? Absolutely traumatic. And here's the thing about trauma. Significant or insignificant really isn't the issue. Trauma impacts your world, no matter how it is, because that's just the nature of it, right? The worst day of somebody's life is simply our work day. The very nature of what we do is based in trauma. If there was no trauma, we wouldn't need to do what we do, right? But it becomes a part of you. See, everything I experience in my life becomes a part of who I am, becomes a part of the timeline of my life, and it begins to shape and view those things that I look at and how my likes, my dislikes. Like I know I don't like Brussels sprouts because my mama tried to feed them to me when I was a little kid, right? So I've experienced Brussels sprouts and know that I don't like those things. And that's the same thing with what experience does. Every time you experience something, it becomes a part of who you are, the timeline of your life. Do you remember every experience you've ever had? Yeah, right? It's like food. I don't remember every meal I've ever eaten, but trust me, every meal I have ever eaten shapes me for who I am today, right? And that's exactly what trauma is, and what trauma does is it starts to shape our experiences, and it starts to shape the outlook of what we look at. And so secondary traumatic stress is that duress when we start hearing about, it's not our trauma. And think about the calls that you go on. Think about the incidences you've responded to. The trauma has already taken place. That's why somebody called 911, right? Nobody calls 911 for a good day. They call 911 because something bad has happened in their world. And that trauma has happened. And then we show up on the scene and they tell us the story about what took place. The witnesses, the mechanism of the scene tells us the story with intensity of what has happened. And so we're starting to become impacted by that trauma. And so we have to crack the nut of secondary traumatic stress, take a look inside it and go, why does somebody else's trauma have an impact on me? What is it about experiencing somebody else's trauma that now starts to shape my worldview, right? So we crack the nut to take a look at what's inside secondary traumatic stress. And we find these two things. We find trauma and we find grief. We're literally immersed in society's trauma. I want you to think about this for a second. So I just mentioned a second ago, nobody calls 911 for a good day, right? Any dispatchers in here by any chance? Anybody? No? Okay. Because I always like to ask the dispatchers in the room, have you ever taken a 911 call where someone said, I had a great day today, I got a raise and a promotion, and I want a firefighter to come to my house, I injured crew from down the street, come to my house and have a beer with me. And I've never had a dispatcher say, yes, I've taken that kind of a call. Now, everybody in my response area knows that ever does happen. That's an automatic chaplain response because I will go have a beer with that guy. Okay. But it doesn't happen. Nobody calls because they're having a good day. Something has gone wrong in their world that day. Some type of circumstance or situation has happened. They call 911 and who shows up? We do. And there's a lot of times we show up and we go, you called 911 for this? Right? See, what we tend to do is we start to look at that trauma and we start to compare other people's trauma, whether it's significant, insignificant, right? And all that kind of stuff. But the truth is it's not ours. It's happening to them. So every time you respond out to a 911 call, there's some form of trauma that has taken place. Something has happened in their world to cause a problem to happen. And then we see that, we're exposed to that. And we drop it in our little bucket and we walk away from it. So we're literally immersed in society's trauma. Every time we go to work, we're immersed in it all day, every day. And then what happens with that is one of the things that trauma causes is it causes loss. And if you know anything about loss or about grief, grief is not about death, grief is about loss. So when somebody loses something that's special to them, whether it's the innocence of the way the world is supposed to be, or it's life or health or property, they've experienced a loss. And think about it, when somebody calls 911, there's some form of a loss that's happened. They're going to have a grief response because grief is a natural response to some form of loss. The more significant that loss is, the more complex that grief response becomes. And so we are literally immersed in society's trauma. That means that we have become shareholders in society's grief. Now think about that for a second. Let that soak in for just a second. What does it mean to be a shareholder? It means ownership, that you have some form of ownership in what is happening within that thing that you sharehold with, right? So we're literally shareholders. We have ownership in the grief that society suffers and exhibits because of the loss that they've taken place, because we're connected to that trauma. So when you crack open secondary traumatic stress, you see this. This is what you see. Now, what is trauma? Trauma is a response to a deeply distressing, disturbing event that seems to overwhelm an individual's ability to cope, right? So we look at, I love these words like deeply distressing, disturbing, overwhelmed. Those are big words that have big meanings to us. And especially those of us in first response, we tend to be the grandiose, big, like, ooh, if it's overwhelming, it's this over here, right? And so I think, okay, if it overwhelms my ability to cope, that means I'm not able to function. And we kind of get caught up in some of those words. But think about this for a second. What does the word, like if you hear somebody say they're emotionally out of control, what does the word out of control mean to you? Just curious, no right or wrong. I'm just kind of curious what you would think the word out of control means. What's that?
Explosive.
Explosive, sure. Yeah. Yeah, what else? What else does out of control mean? Chaos, yeah.
Dysregulated.
Right? I picture someone rolling around on the floor, kicking and screaming and crying and right? They're out of control. So when we start talking about being overwhelmed or out of control, those are the types of things that we think of. And we're like, well, I'm not out of control, right? But I want you to think of it in terms of this. Have you ever hydroplaned in your car before? Right? And what's that immediate feeling for just that split second that you're not in control of that car because you're hydroplaning, like, oh my God, okay, all right, I'm good. Am I right? Right? So when we start talking about things like overwhelmed your ability to cope, what we're really talking about is emotional hydroplaning. There's this moment where you're like, I'm off, okay, I think I'm good. And regain that control, right? And so that's what that trauma response for so many of us is on a regular basis. And that's why we call it the chronic trauma response, is because we're constantly chronically exposed every day we go to work. And not only that, but trauma is extremely powerful. There's a lot of this that when we start talking about these things, it's having this little bit of a perception shift of what trauma is. It's not necessarily, and this is going to sound weird, but just kind of hear and follow along with me for a second. Trauma is not necessarily good or bad. Trauma is, right? And then we start to assign different qualifiers to that trauma that then begins to make it significant or insignificant. So the more, gore or blood or mass casualty type, that's significant. The car crash with the fatalities, that's bad trauma. Absolutely. But what it is something that's happened, it's taken place. It's an event that's happened. And we start to assign those qualifiers to that, right? So trauma is so powerful. Like I said earlier, it doesn't matter who you are, it's still going to affect your life. And it has the power to literally rewire your memory storage processing. Absolutely, it does. If you ask me what I had for breakfast 3 days ago, I'm going to have to stop and think about it for a minute because I really don't remember exactly what I had for breakfast 3 days ago. But 19 years ago, baby Jack Hartley died on his 6 months birthday, and I can tell you absolute details of that call. Details of that call from 19 years ago, because that's how powerful trauma is. It can literally rewrite your memory storage processing, right? So trauma impacts us. And so when we talk about secondary traumatic stress and we look inside of it, we see trauma and we see grief. And what starts to happen is as we start to experience that traumatic experience, somebody else's traumatic experiences, we start to exhibit some of those same signs and symptoms as if it is our own trauma. And so we start looking at what trauma, how it affects us. We know that trauma is that response to that distressing event. It causes feelings of helplessness. Feelings of helplessness are not good feelings for first responders. We don't like to feel helpless because we're a bunch of control freaks, right? But here's the key. It diminishes a sense of self and the ability to feel a full range of emotions and experiences. It starts to diminish how we can control our emotional experiences. So I'll use myself as an example. I don't watch sad movies anymore on purpose. If I know a movie is going to be sad, I just purposely don't watch it because I have a hard time regulating my emotional experience when that sad part of that movie happens. So my wife rents that movie, The Purpose of a Dog's Life, or Dog's Purpose, or whatever, where that dog dies and then reincarnates into another dog. I had no idea what it was about. You should know if their dog is in the title, it's probably going to be sad in some way, right? But I didn't know. And she's like, somebody told me it was good. Let's watch this. When that dog died for the first time, a quarter of the way into that movie, I was a complete and utter wreck. Right? Because the ability to control that emotional experience. How many of you are married or have somebody that's special in your life, right? What happens when we get into an emotional discussion with with our spouse or our loved one? About 20 minutes into that conversation, we have become emotionally overloaded and we flip a switch and go into problem solving mode. And we're like, okay, yeah, oh, you got it. Let's solve this problem. Why are we still talking about this? Right? About 20 minutes in, because 20 to 25 minutes is kind of a typical time frame for most of what we do on a regular basis, show up on the scenes, right? That typical aid call, we deal with that situation, and then we close that door and we walk away, and we do that day in and day out. And now I'm in an emotional situation at home, about 20 minutes in, flip the switch, problem solving mode. Why are we still talking about this? We get quickly overwhelmed. It's a diminished sense of the ability to feel that full range of emotions. We shut down quicker than what we would normally do. Longer term reactions include unpredictable emotions, flashbacks, strained relationships, and even physical type symptoms. And then we start looking at the shared effects of grief. So you'll start to recognize some of these things within our own lives. We start looking at these things. The physical impacts of grief: shortness of breath, loss of appetite, fatigue, and sleep problems. Sleep deprivation, sleep problems is an issue that we have in emergency services, and a lot of it goes into it, but this plays a part of it. And emotional impacts: numbness, anger, resentment, ongoing sadness, a loss of interest in the things that used to bring you pleasure. Has anybody read the book by Dr. Gil Martin called Emotional Survival for Law Enforcement? Anybody in here read that book? You should read it. If there's any book that I would recommend that anybody in first response reads, it's that book. It's called Emotional Survival for Law Enforcement by Kevin Gil Martin. You can get it on Amazon for like $19.95. He said the biggest mistake he made in writing that book was that he titled it for law enforcement, because everybody thinks, well, gosh, it's a book for cops. Well, it is law enforcement specific, but the principles in that book across the board match and fit. One of the things he talks about is the Eustis. When we start to become overwhelmed by the chronic exposure to trauma, we start to get the Eustis. I used to hike. I used to target shoot. I used to mountain bike. I used to golf. I used to underwater basket weave. Whatever it is that hobby that you do that brings you pleasure, it becomes a used to, and you find yourself just not doing it anymore because the lack of energy that you have to go out and to actually participate and do it, and it becomes a used to. Social impacts of grief. So 23 years of working with first responders, a lifetime of growing up in the home of a first responder. The number one thing that I have observed in any of our first responders when it comes to dealing and starting to become a little bit overwhelmed by what we're experiencing because of the trauma is that we emotionally and socially isolate and withdraw from social interaction. We start to shut down and turtle up. And there's a lot of reasons for it. Well, part of that is because we withdraw from others in order to cope with their grief or avoid negative judgment. I have another presentation with a meme that says, it's not that I don't like people, I just feel better when they're not around, right? We start to turtle up, especially we start to feel, we've been exposed. You go a couple of shifts where you've had a couple of pretty difficult calls or a lot of calls and you're feeling tired, emotionally drained, and we tend to start shutting down emotionally and socially, where I don't feel like going out and doing things, or I just want to be home and just kind of veg and just sit. We start to isolate. I remember one day, very specifically when I was a little kid, in fact, I was 8. We lived in Enumclaw on a little farm, and we had horses and cows and a really, really mean rooster. During the summertime, when my dad would come home from his shift, it was normal for us to go on a horseback ride because he'd been gone for 24 hours and he'd come home, we'd saddle the horses. I remember when I was 8, he came home one day and he saddled his horse, and he left without me, without saying anything. Do you think it had an impact on my world that day? Absolutely it did. I never understood it until just recently when I figured out he had experienced something on his shift that day. And when he got home, he was actually, it was a form of isolation. He needed to process and deal with it. But instead of communicating, right, he just went and did. And we start to see all different types of forms of isolation and withdrawal. The number one thing that I witnessed in firefighters, and a lot of that is because that's the impacts of grief. So when you look at grief and the impacts of grief, those are those things. So if we're immersed in society's trauma, we start to exhibit society's trauma symptoms. We're shareholders in society's grief. We begin to exhibit society's grief symptoms. And those are a big part of those things. And that's what comes from that secondary traumatic stress. So the question becomes, why? If it's not my trauma, right? If it's not mine, it's somebody else's, it's taken place to them. Why is it that I'm connected to that trauma? What is it about that trauma that connects to me? And I begin to exhibit those things. And I'll tell you, it's a simple, very simple answer. Because you're human. There's no magic pill. There's no magic to this thing. There's no special formula. It's simply because we're human. Right. And we've had this stigma in our culture that showing or having feelings or exhibiting some form of feelings is a sign of weakness. The truth is that it's just about being human. Right. When you start to look at the things that make us human, things like empathy, the ability to understand or to feel what somebody else is going through. Right. Most of us who are in these jobs have a very strong sense of empathy. It drives us to want to help other people. And with empathy is that compassion. So when I experience or see somebody going through a terrible situation, I have compassion for them, which that's the thing that drives me to want to do something about it. And so as first responders, our empathy and our compassion are very deeply set and deeply rooted. Now, I know for some of us who like a big, strong firefighter, a big, strong cop, that's like empathy. Yeah, yes, that's the thing that makes you human, right? And so Figley, who is a psychologist who coined this term compassion, people talked about in just a second, said we've not been directly exposed to the trauma scene. Again, trauma's taken place already, right? Something happens, somebody calls 911, we get the call. There's no yes or no buttons on our dashboard. Wouldn't that be nice? Right? Get dispatched, if it's CPR? No. You know? We go. We're there. So we've not been directly exposed to the trauma scene, but we hear the story told with such intensity. We arrive on that scene and we witness the mechanism. We hear the stories being told by the witnesses. We do our triage to see what is going on. We're told the story with such intensity, and we hear similar stories so often, and we have this gift and curse of extreme empathy we suffer. Here's what he said. We feel the feeling of our clients, we experience their fears and dream their dreams, and eventually we start to lose a certain spark of optimism, humor, and hope. We're tired, we aren't sick, but we're not ourselves. Something is beginning to change within how we view the world and the people around us. And because of that drive for empathy that we have, that deep empathy that we have, that does, this is why we do what we do. Have you ever had somebody say, why are you a firefighter? Why are you a first responder? Right. And if we were being honest with ourselves, most of us who are in the fire service, we were doing it because we just like fire. We love running into burning buildings, which, by the way, just as a side note, do you know why we make firefighters wear SCBAs? It's not because of breathing stuff, it's because we have to cover your face. It's a really bad look for the public to see you giggling like a little kid running into a burning building, right? So we're like, hey, wear this SCBA, right? Cover the face. We like to do those kind of things, but we also want to help people. And that's why we get into these types of businesses. We want to be able to help people. That's empathy, which is driven with compassion. But the other thing that we have to add on there that makes us human is this thing called a mirror neuron. A mirror neuron is this thing in our head that tends to mirror the emotional expressions of other people. So we talked about why does somebody else's trauma impact me? It's because we're connected to that person or that situation on an emotional energy level, which I'll explain in a second. But the other part of that, through that empathy and compassion, but the other part of that is that mirror neuron. So have you ever been watching like a football game and linebackers got the ball running down the field, not the linebacker, the running back, and the linebacker comes out of nowhere and just absolutely plows the guy, right? Knocks him off his feet, helmet goes flying. And what's your response, your reaction when you're watching that? Right? Can you like it's like you felt that, like ow, or it's America's Funniest Home Videos. This guy's standing there, now nowhere, something, bam, you're like, ooh, that hurt, right? Did that actually hurt you? No. That's a mirror neuron. So somebody in the back corner of the room is laughing their head off. They're just absolutely rolling laughing, and you're like, yeah, I wonder what they're laughing about, and we start to chuckle, right? Never mind that they're probably making fun of you, and you don't know that, but because they're laughing so hard, it makes you, that's a mirror neuron. You're kneeling on the floor beside a 13-year-old kid doing CPR, and dad is rubbing his ankles, begging his son to live. How can you not feel that? Or that mama whose little baby just passed away, died from SIDS. And this happened, it was just a little bitty apartment complex, little bitty apartment. And this young mama, her baby wasn't breathing, and she called 911, and firefighters get there. There's like 6 firefighters, 2 medics, a battalion chief, an MSO, and 2 firefighters in this room. I mean, it is packed with people. And I've got mama outside by the front door. And they look at me, give me the nod, and tell her, really sorry. And as they start to come out, she's begging them, please going back in to save my baby. How do you not mirror that emotional expression? And that's what a mirror neuron is. So we start talking about why and how these things impact our worlds because it's somebody else's. It's because we're connected to that on an emotional level. And when we talk about emotions and connections on emotions, it's not about me wanting to hug you and say, oh, I love you, make you all better, right? When we talk about emotional energy is our ability to connect to the world around us. And the higher the level of connection, or the higher the intensity of the circumstance, and the more focus of concentration you have to work in that circumstance. So you talk about a high stress, very high difficult traumatic scene, and it takes a tremendous amount of emotional energy to connect with that. And Gil Martin, one of the things he talks about is the emotional energy bank. So I start my day with a certain level of emotional energy. And as I go through my day connected to people and circumstances and situations, I'm spending that emotional energy. By the time I'm done with my shift, I have no emotional energy left. And if emotional energy is about connection, when I walk in the door of my house and somebody who loves me says to me, how was your day? What's our typical response? It's fine. Is that enough information? Right? Now, if you know what fine means, FINE, freaked out, insecure, neurotic, and emotional, your day was probably just fine, right? What does that person who hasn't seen you for the last 24 or 48 hours want to do? They want to connect, right? But that emotional energy that you've spent throughout that shift, that's what so when we talk about emotional energy, that's the things that we're talking about. And it can be as simple as I love pizza. Anybody in here love pizza? I love pizza. Yeah, it makes me feel better when I eat it, right? I love my wife. Those two things had better be different. But it's still connection, right? So when we talk about that emotional energy, the thing that makes us human is that connection that we have on that emotional level, which means we need to talk about the emotional system. We talk about how we experience the world. It's done through this system. As a human being, this system kind of runs how we process and how we think and how we determine things that happen around us and how we experience that. So we experience life through our 5 senses: taste, touch, sight, sound, and smell, right? And there's actually that 6th sense. Have you ever like walked in the room like something's not right here, right? Or you met that one person, we're like, yeah, you and I are not going to be friends. And there's no reason for it. It's just in that sense that you have, right? So that's how we experience life. And then what happens is we process that experience through our perception, how we perceive that event to be to us. And that perception is an attitude towards or way of viewing or regarding a point of view. And then what happens is that as perception starts to communicate with our emotional core. So we talk about emotions and feelings, okay? So here's where I need you to just hang in there with me. I'm going to talk about feelings for just a second, all right? Emotions and feelings are different. We put those two words together all the time. But then the truth is they're very different and they come from very different parts of our brain. So what happens is that emotional core is like, we call it the heart. Ever said to somebody, I love you with all of my heart? Or had somebody say that to you, right? Are you talking about that beating muscle inside of your chest? I kind of hope not, because that's gross. Really, truly. But we're not. What are we talking about? We're talking about the seat of our emotions, the core of who we are, that rational decision part of me that thinks through how life is supposed to be and how I'm supposed to respond to life. That's that emotional core. So when we talk about the emotional system, what's happening is perspective. We process the thing through our perspective, and perspective says to our emotional core, hey, this is good. I like this. And their emotional core is the rational part of our thinking brain, looks at that and goes, yeah, I like this too. And then it assigns a feeling. And that feeling then is the output of what that emotional core is telling us. So it's kind of like the trigger event that takes place is the experience. Then the feeling that comes out the other side is how we respond to that trigger event. So if my perception says this is not good, and rational brain looks and goes, yeah, I agree with you. This is not good. The feeling that comes out is going to be different, right? So like, I don't know, snakes. I hate snakes. I'm definitely afraid of snakes. Anybody in here with me on this? Definitely afraid of snakes. Right? Anybody like snakes, handle snakes, pickups? Really?
Oh, yeah, I love them.
Really? And you, oh my gosh, and you have two of them? Oh man. I walk into a room and there's a snake in a glass cage. I don't even want to be in the room, right? So if I were to walk in the room tonight and on the table right here is a snake, what do you think I would do? Leave. Out the door as quick as possible, right? One of you two would pick it up and chase me with it. Not cool. I want you to know that right now. That's not going to happen, okay? So what happens is I walk in the room, I experience the snake. My perception says to me what? Yes, danger.
Danger noodle.
Yes, danger noodle. Okay, I'll go with that. Danger noodle, right? My emotional core goes, oh, hell yeah, that's dangerous, right? And then the response, the emotional core said, move, go, right? And that's the feeling response. That's how that emotional system works. Well, what happens is when we start to be impacted and we start to chronically be exposed to trauma on an everyday regular basis, it begins to deplete that emotional system. It begins to interrupt the emotional core that starts happening. And so what happens is we start to see a disconnect happening within that rational part of our thinking. And the output of that is an imbalance. So the feeling that comes out, I'm a little bit more irritable. I'm a little bit more socially isolated. I'm a little bit more cynical or more sarcastic or more hypervigilant. I start to project work experiences onto my family. Right. So we have, so I have 3 kids. I have 5 grandkids. One was born like 3 weeks ago, which is really cool. And every summer, my wife makes me set up a swimming pool in our backyard so the kids can come and play in that swimming pool. And I hate that pool. It's one of those 8 foot by 3 foot pools. You know what I'm talking about? She says, time to set the pool up. I drag my feet for 2 weeks. I don't want to set that pool up. And it's a very simple mathematical equation. Little kids plus water equals drownings. And every summer for the past 23 years, I'm knocking on somebody's door to tell them their son or daughter has drowned in one of our lakes, rivers, or streams, and they're never coming home again. And I'm out there starting to put the swimming pool together, and I start thinking about what would happen if one of the I can't even go there. I can't even think about it. It makes me physically ill. So I'm going to take that experience away from them so I don't have to deal with that experience, right? Projection of work experiences onto our families and other people around us. So this trauma starts to cause feelings of helplessness. It starts to diminish that sense of self and the ability to feel that full range of emotions. So my output starts to become off because the system is unbalanced. That's what we talk about, that depleted or unbalanced system, that outward response. We just simply become overwhelmed quickly, more quickly. And the longer we're in this job, the more quickly that overwhelmed feeling can become, because we're chronically exposed to trauma and on an everyday regular basis. And so what happens? This is where vicarious trauma begins to take place. We talk about that output, right? What does that output look like? Increased cynicism, sarcasm, and hypervision, just like I was talking about. Anybody, this look familiar to anybody? Before and after, right? Yeah. So we talk about, when we talk about emotional and social isolation, a part of that is that that view of the world that we have, we become more cynical. And cynicism is a mistrust of other people's motives. So how many of you, when you go to a restaurant, sit with your back to the wall by any chance, where you can see the door? Does anybody do that? Wow, got pretty much across the board. Why? Why do we do that? I want to see the exit. It's called situational awareness or officer safety, right? It's antisocial behavior. If you really start looking at it. Now, I'm not saying it's wrong, and I'm not saying you shouldn't do it, but I want you to see it for what it is. It's cynicism. It's a mistrust of other people's motives. If that was normal social behavior, there would be no chairs or tables in the middle of any restaurant. They'd all be along the walls, but they're not. Normal social behavior dictates you can go in and you can have your meal and laugh and talk and be good. I walk in, I'm like, where can I sit when I can see the door? Right? That's cynicism, mistrust of other people's motives. Then my wife, she thinks it's funny to beat me to the table and sit with her back to the wall because she knows it bothers me. And then she's like, why does it bother you? You're not in uniform. Nobody knows what you do. And I'm like, you don't get it. Right? So I'm constantly, I'm eating like this. Right? Sarcasm. Anybody speak sarcasm in here? You're free to, yeah, absolutely. That was a sarcastic question. All your answers, sarcastic answers, by the way. Sarcasm is an emotional safety relief valve. And actually, in all honesty, it's not a bad coping skill for us. Think about the things that we have to do. Think about the things that we see. How do we do this? Right? And so what happens is somebody cracks off with a sarcastic comment. And what does that do? We all laugh and chuckle. When you laugh, it literally releases dopamine into your system, and dopamine makes you feel better. So then you can press through and continue to do what it is you're doing. So when you're in a difficult emotional situation, somebody cracks off that comment, we laugh, we feel better, we press on. So like we had a guy hit by a train.
When you come up this way, I want you to real quick before we grab,
He's like, hey, we're
you to
missing a right
take
arm.
your pills, okay?
So the cops and I are walking through the tall grass.
I have water here
Right
that
arm.
you can have it with.
Somebody says, wave his hand when you find it. Yeah, it's like, really? You know?
Okay, here's the pill.
I mean, how else do you walk through the tall grass looking for some guy's right arm? So it's actually not a bad coping skill for us. It's an emotional safety relief valve. The problem is when it becomes out of balance. And you make that sarcastic remark and everybody that's there, instead of laughing, everybody looks at you and someone goes, dude, that was dark. Right? Or you're in an emotional discussion with your spouse. 20 minutes in, it's starting to get a little bit intense. You make a sarcastic remark to relieve that emotional pressure. Oh my God, that does not work. Take it from me. You don't need to experience that. Just trust me on that one, right? But we have that hypervigilance. Drove into the neighborhood the other day. I live in a very nice neighborhood in Maple Valley on a cul-de-sac. There's a car I've never seen before parked on the sidewalk close to our house. So I go inside and tell my wife, there's a suspicious vehicle out front. How long has that car been there? And she looks at me really funny and she goes, that's our neighbor's new car. Now, if she would have said that's our new car, there's a whole nother set of issues we're going to have to deal with at that point in time. But how come I can't see a car that I've never seen before and think to myself, oh, the neighbors must have got a new car. That's cool. That car's suspicious. Why? Because I've never seen it before, right? That's hyper vigilance about those types of things. This is the shift in the worldview that we have. Critical thinking towards others, where they live, what they drive, what they wear, project your work experience, emotional blunting. Have you ever had somebody telling you a really sad story? Not at work, it's a personal friend or a family member, and they're like telling you this thing that happened to them, and everybody's like, oh my God, that's horrible. I can't believe you're going through that. It's so sad. And you're sitting there listening to it, and on the inside, you're like, and when are you going to be done talking? Right? No connection. That emotional blunting that takes place. Why? Because, man, we have heard that story over and over and over again, right? Sleep disturbance issues, a reduced sense of personal accomplishment, meaning. Our bullshit meter is stuck on all the time. All the time. Everybody that we're talking to, right? When that emotional system gets depleted, these are the outputs of that unbalanced system. This stuff doesn't make us wrong. It's not bad. It just is what it is. Right? But the problem comes in is when that unbalance continues to regulate our world and our interactions with other people, because it changes how we interact, not just in our professional lives, but more importantly, in our personal lives. And with how we interact with our families and that vicarious trauma, which then results in what we call compassion fatigue. And that compassion fatigue, literally what it sounds like. I'm just tired of caring. Now, to get that, so we have to understand, it's like, but I care. But what that means is that I start to lack the energy to do the things that I care about and connect with the people that I care about, the energy that I have. So this, it's like my energy tank is empty. Well, Stigley quote, there we go. I've said that once already. It kind of goes with that. It's actually supposed to be a different quote, so I apologize. But the interruption of your emotional connections, the feeling of being empty, lack of caring is what compassion fatigue is. And so when we start looking at that, what we're starting to see is that it's a process, it's not a diagnosis, right? So Osberg says, you have to understand that this is a process, and Osberg is another psychologist who is a contemporary of Stigley. Says it's not that one day you're living your life with a great deal of energy and enjoyment, and the next you wake up exhausted and devoid of energy. Compassion fatigue takes time to develop. It's that constant exposure to trauma and other people's incidences that take place. Over time, your ability to feel and care for others becomes eroded, right? And so when we talk about what that looks like is this. When you have no energy to care about, what happens? We start to get numb. And numbness is just our body's way. It's a normal defense mechanism of the mind to protect us from becoming overwhelmed. So when we start to become overwhelmed quickly, like watching a sad movie, listening to a sad story, or the constant stuff. And so I just like, if I start to numb myself to that and choose not to participate, those types of things, that numbness just protects that situation of being overwhelmed. Menial tasks don't get done. There's trouble concentrating, forgetfulness, decision fatigue. Decision fatigue is something we deal with a lot. Not too long ago, my wife says, we're going to paint the bedroom. Should we paint it white or eggshell white? Really? Menus. I hate menus. I really do. When I always order the same thing every time I go to a restaurant because I just don't have the energy to sit there and go, gee, what do I want to eat? And if I've never been to that restaurant before, hamburger or fish and chips. And even then I'm like, which one do I want, right? The Cheesecake Factory is a decision fatiguer's nightmare. Absolutely, right? But when we just have trouble, I just hard time making a decision, that decision fatigue out of mind, anxiety. And it's not, we take in terms of anxiety about, oh my God, I can't do this. So what's going to happen next? But it's not necessarily that side of anxiety. It's that low level buzz within you that just is like, I don't know that I really want to be here right now. There's a lot happening. There's a lot going on. There's what's going to happen. It's just kind of that low level buzz is what we're talking about. Remember, we talked about the emotional hydroplane, right? That's just that low level, what we're talking about there, the isolation because people don't understand. So we isolate from them. So my little meme here, if you care less, you stress less. That sounds good, doesn't it? If I don't care, I don't have to stress about it because it makes absolutely no difference what takes place. But do you see the danger in that? How much danger is in that? When you stop caring about your family and the things that are going on in their world, you stop caring about your job performance and those kind of things, everything goes downhill from there. We have to care. But the caring is being eroded because of the connection that we have to trauma on an everyday, regular basis. So what do we do about it, right? Becomes the question, especially trauma, because can we take trauma out of our jobs? No, you can't take trauma out of the job. You just can't. It's there. The very nature of what we do is founded in trauma that takes place on the street, whether it's caused by accident or caused by somebody doing something stupid. It happens. So our options are simply this. Don't be exposed to it. Quit. Get out. Right? Now, I'm not advocating to anybody that you quit. Not what I'm saying. But it is an option. Right? Or we stuff it. Which, honest to God, that's our default setting. It really is. That's for most of us, our personality styles, we just stuff it. Because it's actually up front, it's easier to stuff it and not do anything with it than it is to actually try to process what we're experiencing. Because I don't want to hurt. I don't want to feel it. So I'm just going to stuff it. The problem is, my wife reminds me of this all the time, that doing nothing is actually doing something. It just doesn't end well. Right? Our third option is to find balance. And that's what I want to talk about. The truly tough person in the healthiest sense of the word is not the one who avoids stress, but the one who knows how to process it and deal with it as it's happening. right? We want to be healthy. We want to find what we call emotional balance. And we're going to tell you exactly how to do that after a 5-minute break. That sound like a plan? We've been talking for almost 55 minutes. It is time for a break because I'm starting to lose my
Cookies and drinks over there. Homemade cookies.
Yeah. I learned in when I was doing a class on how to be an instructor was don't give them 5 minutes, give them 6 or give them 7, some weird number because people
Now,
come back
300
in that,
seconds.
right? Yeah. Anybody have any questions about what we've been talking about or comments or thoughts or anything at all? Yes,
Not a first responder,
I'm sorry.
but am a behavioral health specialist.
Oh, okay,
with
cool.
The health department,
Right,
the
right.
response division.
Yep, yep.
Crisis intervention,
Yeah,
stuff like that.
yeah,
So
absolutely.
it's still very applicable.
It's absolutely, anybody who works with people.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, and these days, that's first responder in my book anyway.
Yeah,
I mean,
no
that's
kidding.
what's going on, you know.
Yeah, it's still very applicable.
But,
Yeah,
I work very closely with a lot of
Yeah.
patients.
yeah, you're in that mix.
Yeah.
Right, yeah, exactly. So, anybody have anything? Does it make sense?
I'm just reflecting on 30 years, Pat, and seeing all
Right.
these behaviors over the years, like, oh, I remember that guy, or I remember that person, or I remember me doing this. or-
Yeah.
Yeah, so a lot of it.
Yeah, there's things, I mean, there's so much within our careers that we'll never forget. It's always a part of who we are, part of the timeline of our lives, you know? Yeah, absolutely. So, well, let's talk about emotional balance. Because when that system, when that system is impacted by trauma, that's where that imbalance starts to come in. And that's where that feeling response thing becomes out of whack, right? So we're not sick, we're not wrong, we're not broken, we're human. And that's important. And especially those of you on a peer support team, one of the things that we want to do is remind people that you're human. You know, it happens, it's okay. So emotional balance occurs when you are processing the emotions when they come your way for the appropriate amounts of time. So emotional balance is about being able to process through what it is that we're experiencing. Emotional balance helps us maintain or attain flexibility and promote stabilization between your mind and your body. So that emotion to feeling, perspective, transfer line right, we're promoting stabilization. It helps you, this is key, it helps us to respond to negative emotions and thoughts without getting stuck in them. Default setting for us, right? We get stuck in our negative emotions and our negative thoughts. Why? Because we are performance oriented. How we do our job matters. Anybody in this room, your own worst critic? It's a part of who we are, right? And so when the outcome of a situation isn't what I think it should be, then it's probably because I've done something wrong or I'm not good enough. That's where we go. And we get stuck in that. And so when we start talking about balance, it helps us to respond to those things without getting stuck in them. So what we talk about is practicing resiliency, engaging in what we call purposeful emotional self-care, and a working knowledge of self-care techniques, which that's what we're going to cover for the rest of our class. So we're going to talk about how do we find balance? Because remember, you can't take trauma out of the job. It's there. Whether it's significant or insignificant trauma, it's still going to have an impact on our world because we're chronically exposed to it on an everyday, regular basis. So we start to think about what and understanding what emotional balance is. Emotional balance is not the absence of emotional tension. All right. It's not the absence of stress. That's what stress is. Stress is emotional tension. The feeling of physiological strain and unease produced by situations of danger, threat, loss of personal security, internal conflicts, frustrations, loss of self-esteem, and grief. Trauma, right? So emotional tension is stress. Life produces stress. There is no such thing as the absence of stress. In fact, you know what the absence of stress is? Anybody want to guess what the absence of stress is?
Death.
Death. Yeah, it is, right? Why? Because stress is a part of our lives. It lets us know that we're alive. Did you know that stress is not always bad? There's actually good forms of stress, and there's a reason and a purpose for stress. It lets us know that we're alive. It lets us know that we're in danger. It lets us know that something is going on within our world that maybe needs to change. the absence of stress is death. If somebody ever invites you to a weekend conference and that conference is all about eliminating stress from your life, I'd be really concerned about the last day. Like really concerned, right? Because stress is a part of us. So the key is, and we've heard it all, we've heard this, stress management, right? We've heard that term and we know the principles of stress management, eating right, getting enough sleep, exercise, all of those things. So it's not about getting rid of that stress, it's about managing that stress. And so when we talk about emotional balance, it's not getting rid of that stress, it's about finding balance within your world, because the only way to deal with that trauma is either get out or do something about it. So when we talk about emotional tension, you ever tried to balance on something, right? You get up and you're on this thing and you're like kind of about balancing, you're trying to find that angle and you get it, you're like, okay, I'm there, I'm good, right? And you kind of got to hold tension on that. If you're looking at maintaining or gaining or doing emotional balance, it's actually something you have to do on a regular basis. It's something that you have to engage in on a regular basis. And the problem with a lot of us as first responders, so we are like all about right now. If it's happening right now, we'll deal with it. If it's going to happen tomorrow, we'll figure it out when it gets here. If it happened yesterday, well, it happened yesterday. Can't do nothing about it now, right? It's that 911 system that we operate on. Somebody needs help, we respond to it right now, and we go. So oftentimes what ends up happening is we just kind of move through our lives until something bad happens, and then we're like, oh my God, I should do something about this. And that's when we try to do it. But really, if you really want to find that true balance within your world, you have to be every day be doing something about that and investing in that. So emotional balance is managing the tension. We have to, and the key is stop thinking about it's a paradigm shift. It's not that stress is good or bad. Stress just is. Trauma just is. It is there. And if I can accept that, part of that is accepting that. And so when we start looking at what emotional balance is, well, part of that is resiliency, or what we would call psychological body armor. So you've heard the term resiliency? It's a big buzzword right now that's going around in a lot of circles, especially within peer support and different things, talk a lot about resiliency. What is resiliency? If you look at the definition of what resiliency is, the definition is the capacity to recover quickly from difficulties. It's a toughness. It's being tough. Do you have to be tough to do this job? You do, right? And there's a lot of people who can't do this job because they're not tough enough. And that's not saying something bad about them, but not everybody can do the job. And that's okay. We all have the things that we can and can't do. Resiliency is being prepared to deal with the impacts of trauma. That's why we call it psychological body armor. I know in our area, we in South King County, our firefighters, when they respond to a scene of violence, they have to wear body armor. Everybody's issued a set of body armor. And when they go to a scene of violence, they have, by policy, they have to wear the body armor. Law enforcement wears body armor. Why? Because it's about the potential that there's a great potential that maybe something could happen, and we want you to be prepared for it. So when we talk about psychological body armor resiliency, it's about being prepared. Anybody a runner in here? Anybody run? You run? I'm sorry, I knew there was something wrong about this back corner here. Some of you like snakes, some of you run. I'm not a runner, right? Do you run marathons by any chance?
Yeah, trail.
Okay, you're a trail runner. All right, that's cool, right? What's your name?
Rachel.
Rachel. Okay, so Rachel comes and says, hey, Pat, I'm running a marathon this weekend, and I want you to run with me. Do I look like a runner? No, I'm not, right? And I'd be a complete idiot to go, let's do it. I'm ready to go, right? Because you'd all be practicing your CPR skills on me. Not going to happen. But if she said to me, hey, I'm going to run a marathon in 6 months and I want you to run with me, would I be more apt to say yes to that? Well, the truth is I would say no, because I am not a runner, okay? But let's just run with this example, no pun intended there, but let's just run with this. I could say, yeah, you know what, 6 months. So what am I going to do between now and 6 months? I'm going to train. I'm going to get that app, the Couch to 5K app, right? You know, and I'm going to get ready. 6 months goes by, day of the marathon comes. I am looking good, right? I've lost a lot of weight. I'm feeling good. Marathon starts. Woohoo! Get out there. We run. We finish. What happens at the end? Am I tired? Am I sore? I'm like, oh my God, I can't believe I did that. I did it. I finished it. Or am I like, let's do that again? Yeah, right now. Let's run the course backwards, right? No, I'm going to be hurting. I'm going to be sore. I mean, that's the reality of it. And then I'm going to stop and think, oh my God, my bedroom's upstairs. Screw it. Because my couch is not that comfortable, right? And for the next couple of days, I'm going to hurt. But because I've been preparing for that, I'm going to bounce back that much quicker. Had I not been preparing for it, it would take even that much longer, right? So what resiliency is, it's about being prepared. So when that day happens, you can bounce back. It doesn't say that that's not going to hurt. It doesn't say that that situation isn't going to have some kind of an impact on you. It simply says that you're going to be able to come back that much faster. So that means that we have to be actively engaged in preparation for that day. That's what it is about being prepared. So it's not about resistance. Resiliency is not resistance. So stress management is resiliency. It's not good Lord. I'm having a hard time with this. The goal of stress management is stress resiliency, not stress resistance. Because we can't be resistant to stress. That's just not, it's just not, we can't. So we need to be able to manage that and be prepared. And that's what resiliency is. Second part of this is what we call purposeful emotional self-care. And I use the word purpose on purpose, right? Again, because we typically wait until something happens and then we're like, oh, I should probably do something for self-care. No, we have to be purposeful on an everyday, regular basis that we're doing something to improve our worlds. All right. So when we talk about intervention is a kind of a spectrum of a word. One side of intervention goes, oh my God, you've got a raging alcohol problem and we need to get you help and in the treatment, you're destroying your family and that we're going to do an intervention, right? But the true definition of intervention is anything that you can do to make your world better. Now, do you notice what that does not include? It doesn't say if things are going bad, you should do something to make your world better. It's anything that you can do at any point in time to make your day better is what intervention is. So regular, purposeful intervention. So purposeful action is defined as a series of actions or steps that are motivated by a commitment to mission. When I make a commitment to say, I'm going to purposely make sure that I'm doing something on a regular basis to maintain my emotional stability and balance. I'm looking at how I can do purposeful self-care on a regular basis. When I have that mission, it's being intentional. When we have a sense of purpose, it intends to increase optimism, resiliency, and hope. And think about that. Having that sense of mission increases your optimism, your resiliency, and your hope. You know what trauma takes away from us? One of the number one things trauma steals? Hope. It does. Chronic exposure to hope, or to hope, chronic exposure to trauma takes our hope. We start to lose hope in the world, that world is a good place. We start to lose hope in our ability to do things to make the world a better place. The lack of hope is one of the key predictors in the development of post-traumatic stress disorder. But more importantly, the lack of hope is one of the key elements of suicidal ideology in the act of suicide. I've lost hope. There's nothing else that I can do. That's where we get into that hopelessness and that worthlessness, and my lack of belong. I don't belong anymore, and that's where that suicide gets into play there. So we're able to do something that increases our hope, right? Hope is that feeling of expectation or desire for a certain thing to happen. Optimism is hopefulness and confidence, right? About the future, resiliency, the capacity to withstand. So having that commitment. So that's why it's a purposeful action that we take, intentional action that we have to constantly, purposely be intentional in maintaining our emotional self-care. So what does that look like? Well, the attitude of realism is a key component of that, right? So, yeah, so optimism, pessimism, realism, glass is half full, glass is half empty, this glass is just full of piss, right? That's what realism is. And so here's where the typical instructor would say, okay, you should be doing yoga and long walks on the beach and journaling and all that kind of stuff, right? This is how you maintain that. I'm not, like I said earlier, we're not gonna go there. But what we are gonna do is give you some just overriding principles that you can start applying to what you would normally do to take care of you. So the attitude of realism is one of those things. What is realism? The attitude and practice of accepting a situation for what it is and being prepared to deal with it accordingly. Do you cause any of the trauma that takes place out there on the street? No. Can you change anything that happens out there on the street? Can you go back in time? I've learned over the years that life is literally a matter of seconds and inches. If that car was just 10 seconds slower, or if I got held up at that crosswalk, just one light rotation, that pedestrian wouldn't have been hit because they wouldn't have been in that crosswalk, right? It's just, we can't change any of that stuff. We can't go back and change what's taken place. It happened. And when you're on shift in that particular area on that particular day and somebody calls 911, guess who's going to go and be there? You are. You're going to be the one that's going to be there. And you wouldn't have it any other way because that's what we do, right? But now that you're there, you're experiencing, there's nothing you can do to go back and change it. So part of finding that place of emotional balance is understanding that it happened. And it is okay not to be okay. If I'm impacted by something that I see, it's not because I'm wrong. It's not because I'm sick. It's not because I'm weak. It's simply because I'm human. I can't tell you how many times I've sat down with a first responder and they're like, I don't know why I should be feeling this way. I'm supposed to see this stuff. In fact, I see it on a regular basis and I'm fine. Why do I feel the way that I do? And it's like, well, I'm gonna shock you here. Hang on, because I'm gonna tell you the answer. Human. Right? And they're like, yeah, you're human. When we can start to wrap our head around that these things impact us in certain ways simply because we're human, that makes it okay. And when it's okay, I can now be empowered to actually do something about it, right? Because I'm not wrong, I'm not sick, I'm not broken. I'm a person. And it's okay not to be okay. So being real with yourself about what's going on, understanding that the impacts of a traumatic circumstance and the grief that we hold and share with society. It's a part of what trauma is. So it's not bad. So that's what realism is that attitude or perspective shift that says, I'm there, I've experienced it. It doesn't make me wrong or bad or hurt. I'm just human, and that's why. Right? The other thing that goes into this is the management of our expectations. Anybody in this room a control freak? It's okay to admit it, right? A lot of us are. We like to be in control. We kind of like to know how this is going to come out and be good with it, right? So maintaining emotional control is really important for us. But in order to do that, we have to manage expectations. So I love the motto of the fire service: fighting fire, saving lives. Love that. But can you save everybody's life? No, and those of us who have been in this business for any length of time, we know that, right? We know that. But if that's the motto, if that's the expectation, then there's going to be disappointment in that. So when I say we're job performance orientated, we have no room for error in any of our jobs, whether it's law enforcement, fire, dispatch, it doesn't matter. There's no room for error, which means we have to do it right every time. So our job performance matters to us, which means it's important that we're managing the expectation. Now, expectations come from a lot of different places. What does the public expect out of us as first responders? Perfection. Absolutely. Right? Now, anybody in here perfect? Now, I can say I'm darn close to being perfect, and that's only because my wife isn't here, and neither is my cousin, and he can't tell anybody in my family that I said that I'm darn close to being perfect. Unless he's listening online, and I will deny it, Peter, I promise. Okay, so, no, none of us are perfect, and yet the expectation is that we're gonna be perfect every time. So what happens when something happens and the outcome of that circumstance is not what I think it should be? Right? Even if it doesn't matter if I believe that should have been different, then because I'm my own worst critic, because we have such high expectation of our job performance, we start to circle that drain that I'm not good enough. So what we have to really look at is, well, the public expects perfection. Our agencies really expect us to be 100% on our A game every time. But the real expectation has to come from what's in here. Because in the morning, I have to get up and look at myself in the mirror, right? So placing my expectations in the right place. It's not that I'm going to be able to save everybody's lives. It's going to be that I'm going to do the best job I possibly can with the tools and the training that I have. And if I've done that, then I've done my job, and I've done my job well, and I've done my job right. So the expectation isn't necessarily based on the outcome of the circumstance, because I can't control those things that happen around me. I can't control the outcome of those circumstances. I can only control what it is that I do. So it's important that we take a minute and think about that expectation. Expectations in the right place give us control, focusing on our job, doing the job that we have to do, and then processing the emotional experience, right? So that management of expectations is going to be really important. Maintaining our perspective goes right in with that. So when you look at this picture here, who's saved? Honestly, neither one of them, and yet both of them, right? It's all a matter of perspective. So we talk about that perspective and how that plays within our emotional core, and being able to maintain the perspective that, yes, I will do the best that I possibly can, but I can't change and I can't control all of the outcomes. And I can't control all the inputs, but what I can control is how I view that. I didn't cause this to take place. This is not my family. I'm here to do a job to the best of my ability with the tools and the training that I have. And if I can do that, right? So it plays right into that expectation piece, placing your expectations in the right place, but also managing the perspective. I didn't cause it to take place. Even if it is my family, I still didn't cause it to take place. But I'm going to do the best job I possibly can. But what happens if you don't do the job? What happens if you can go, wait a minute, you know what? I don't know that I did the best job I possibly could have done. So we just throw everything out the window and now I'm a bad person? No. All right. What am I going to do the next time I encounter a situation like this? Right? That positive perspective or self-affirmation, which we'll talk about here that in a second. It's vital that we're talking about. There's a therapy technique that is probably one of the most used therapy techniques in the mental health world, and that is talk therapy. Talking about what's taking place. It's a technique used to help a person identify and change troubling emotions, thoughts, and behaviors. Here's why it's important that we're talking about what we experience on the job, what the trauma that we experience is. That one, it overrides isolation. So if we isolate, that's the number one thing that I witness and see with first responders when we start to become overwhelmed is isolation and emotional social isolation withdrawal. What's the one thing that overrides isolation? Connection. If you're talking to somebody, you're connected to somebody. And it's vital that you're connected to somebody. Some of the things that take place when we start talking about what it is that we're going through. Overrides isolation. It helps catalog the experience in your brain. Has anybody ever heard of the lizard brain before? Lizard brain, you haven't heard about it. It's an actual psychological term, and it's a term used for the part of your brain that is responsible for survival and reaction and response. So if you think back to the emotional core, right, and your emotional system, we experience something and our perspective goes, holy crap, this is really bad. And our rational brain goes, yep, you're right. I don't know what to do. I'm completely overwhelmed. I need help. Calls on the lizard brain. The lizard brain pops up and says, dude, I've got this. Day high five. Lizard brain takes over and it's all about response, reaction, survival. Getting it done, getting that job done right now. I'm not even thinking about how I'm doing it. I'm just doing it. I'm in that mode. I'm in that place. It's high stress, high trauma, and I get it done. And then the lizard brain, when it's all over with, 90 minutes later, when things start to calm down, the lizard brain kind of looks around and is like, all right, we survived. Hey, rational brain, you can take back over. Day high five, off lizard brain goes, rational brain comes back up. But here's what happens. Think about your rational brain, right? The part of you that rational thought process is thinking things through. If you think of your life like a parking lot, and that rational brain is taking data that comes in and is putting it into that parking lot. It's the parking lot attendant. And at the end of the day, you've got this nice, even, beautiful, well-parked parking lot. It's all straight, everything is good. That's what the rational brain cares about. The lizard brain doesn't care 2 cents about your parking lot. All it cares about is survival. So it gets into that mode and it's just taking data and just shoving it up there. Get up there, go do this. I'm surviving, reacting, getting this job done. So when the rational brain peeks its head back up, tells the lizard brain, says, hey, we're good to go. They high five, rational brain steps back up, looks at the parking lot, and it's like, holy shit, what did you just do to me? Because this is a freaking mess, right? There's blank spots in my memory. I don't remember that aspect of it. How did this take place? When did this happen? It's all messed up. And so what happens is when you actually talk, when you tell the story from start to finish, it allows your rational brain to start rearranging that data and making sense of what took place. One of the things about a critical incident stress debrief, when it's done right and done well, is it allows that rational brain to rearrange the data with the input of everybody else who was there. Because everybody gets a chance to tell their story, and you get a 360 perspective of what took place. And so that's why talking is so vitally important. It validates that what you're experiencing is real. It actually means something to you. So when we talk about resiliency, and we talk about fear, the courage to be able to tell somebody and be believed. The courage to tell someone and tell the story and have access to information so I can receive support. But the compounding factors that end in fear is when I have to keep it a secret. Well, I might not be believed or I might be punished. So I'm not going to say anything to anybody. They might think that something is wrong with me. I think that something might be wrong with me. And it begins to compound that trauma that we're experiencing, right? So it's vital. It is vital that you're connected to. So it begs the question, who do we talk to, right? Where's our resources? Lots of resources out there. Friends, family, coworkers. So peer support, powerful. Chaplain like myself or your personal clergy. The EAP, the Employee Assistance Program. It's not just about counseling. That's one of the misconceptions about the EAP, that it's just about counseling, but they have all types of other resources that you can access through the EAP. The critical incident stress debrief. What about your spouse? Some of us, our spouse is that we're confident. We can go home. We can talk about the things that we experience in our jobs. But for other people, we don't want to put that on our spouse. So if one of the things that you should be talking about, if you're married or have that person, that special person in your life, how much do they want to know and how much do I want to be able to tell them? Right? When I first became a chaplain and I would go home and tell my wife, gosh, I was on this call and this guy died and his kids were there and it was really sad. And bless her heart, she's tenderhearted and she loves people, and she would cry because it was so sad for 2 days. That didn't work for me. Right? I'm like, this doesn't work. I can't do this to you. Can't put this stuff on you. So I, did what I would typically do. I couldn't quit telling her anything at all. Didn't take too long to figure out that it didn't work for her. Right? So we had to figure out where that is. My wife is not my work confidant. We have decided that our home is a safe place. She doesn't want to know about the grief and the trauma. And I need my home to be that safe spot for me to go home and just be me and not have to think about that. Right? We've made that decision together. She knows who my work confidant is because I have a work confidant. I have somebody who's my peer support, another chaplain in my area, and I sit down and we talk about stuff. And it's really important because he gets it because he does the same thing that I do. But here's the key. One, my wife knows who he is and knows that it's a guy and not another girl. For some reason, that's important to her, right? and she likes to know when I meet with him. I don't have to tell her what it was, but it's just that information, right? So we've had those discussions, and I really encourage that. Getting help is not a sign of weakness, it's just about where that you know your limits, right? Peer support, so powerful. And the reason is because there's an level of understanding there that no one else has, but that person who's done it as well, right? I've never had to do CPR on somebody or walk into a burning building with an SCB. I've never carried a firearm and made an arrest. But even though I've grown up in that and have hung out with people just like you for so long, there's still levels of understanding that I'll never have about what you do because I've not done it. Talking to someone who gets it because they've done it. It can be so powerful, right? It can help you talk about what you're feeling and experiencing. Reassure you're not the only person who's felt like this. Help find support that's right for you. So there's a lot of power in peer support. And by the way, if you're not a formal part of a peer support team, you're still responsible for peer support. It's everybody's responsibility. If you've ever looked at somebody and went, hey, how are you doing after that? Guess what? You just did peer support. You really did. Every one of us can do it, and every one of us should be doing it. And if you have the opportunity to be a formal part of a team, that would be awesome. Mental health professionals, right? You talk about mental health professionals, which is really important. I see if anybody get a physical every year, I get a physical every year. Why don't we do that with our heads? I have a standing appointment with my therapist every 6 months just to do a mental head check. Just to check in, how are you doing? We talk about stress of the job, we talk about home life, and usually things are pretty good. It's not that I need it, but I'm just doing that check-in. And a couple of years ago, he's like, hey, let's meet next week. I'm like, why? What are you telling me? You know, I mean, the business is that bad, you need the money, or maybe something's going on, right? And he's like, no, we need to meet next week. And then that's the kind of relationship. And in between that 6 months period, if they start to go downhill, I've got somebody who knows me, and I can make an appointment. But there's a couple of things that we need to understand about mental health, the mental health world. One is that the mental health world operates on a different system than we do. So we operate on the 911 system, right? You call 911, you're going to get help when? Right now, right? The dispatcher doesn't go, hey, let me check the schedule. All right, on Tuesday next week, they have an opening at 10 o'clock to put your fire out. Does that work for you? No, that does not work for me, right? But that's our system. Well, that is actually how the mental health system works. You call up to make an appointment. When do you want that appointment to happen? Right now, right? One, because we wait till the very last second. I'm in crisis and I need help right now, right? And two, we operate on the system. If I call, I get help right now. The mental health world, it's like putting a square peg in a round hole. You call up to make an appointment. It's Monday, you make the phone call. I don't know what it is about the mental health world, but for some reason, it seems like they don't make any of the return phone calls until Thursday. I don't know if there's some unwritten rule within their line of work that you can't return a call. It's just for some reason. So if you make a call on Monday, guess when you're going to get a call back? Probably on Thursday, right? And then they're going to go, let me check the schedule because I would love to see you. Yep, I've got an opening on Tuesday next week and 2 weeks from now at 10 o'clock. Does that work for you? No, I need it right now. So when it comes to, we really have to kind of figure out a way to put these two worlds together. And part of that is just education on our part, right? Don't wait till the last second. If you're in crisis, don't wait until you're like, I need help right now, because it's really actually going to get difficult for us to get you help right now. That's just the system. Insurance oftentimes can be a thing, or getting to a counselor where they're at. But thank God for the advent of telehealth. The one good thing that came out of COVID is the use of telehealth. And honestly, that's my preferred way of seeing my therapist now. At first, because it was during COVID, and he was like, hey, I can't see you in person. We need to do this via telehealth, right? Stupid rules. And I'm like, oh, okay, whatever. That's going to be stupid. But so literally I got one of my camp chairs out, and I'm in this park, in the back corner of this park with a cigar, talking to my therapist and an iPhone, right? And it was the best therapy session I ever had. He's like, dude, are you smoking a cigar? I'm like, uh-huh. Absolutely, right? I can't do that in his office, but I certainly can do it when I'm doing telehealth. And the studies, actually, they've been doing studies for the effectiveness of telehealth, and they have found that the effectiveness of telehealth is the same as in person. It's pretty much the level playing field, which means that if I've got someone who's struggling with a certain type of issue, and I've got a therapist not in Portland, but in Vancouver, who that's their specialty, guess what? I can connect you with them, right? So that's a part of that, and so having that mental health professional, getting that check-in every 6 months or once a year, organizations such as Code 4 Northwest, which is a crisis hotline for us, right? These are our resources where I can get help and get that resource. Code 4 maintains a list of mental health therapists that have been vetted to understand emergency services. And there's like over 80 names on that list from all over the state of Washington. And they know which insurances those providers take and know what their things that they focus in on. So you can call up and say, hey, I live up in Bellingham and I need to see somebody. Do you have anybody in my area? Or do you have a telehealth person who specializes in this particular thing? Because this is what I'm struggling with. And you know what? They're going to give you like 3 or 4 names and phone numbers, get you connected to somebody. So Code Forward, phenomenal resource for us in emergency services for the state of Washington and your families too. So it's not just for the firefighter, police officer, dispatcher, but for our families. The other thing that's going to be really, really important is that you need to slow down and process. So starting to look at the things that happen within our jobs is instead of like, oh, that's a terrible situation. It's just a speed bump. What's an actual speed bump designed to do in real life? Slow you down, right? Or the politically correct way of saying that now is it's a traffic calming device. Okay, whatever. Designed to slow you down. What happens if you're not calming yourself when you go over a speed bump in your car, right? Yeah, everybody in the back seat hits their head. It's awesome. But if you continue to do that time after time after time, what begins to happen to your car? It begins to break. It begins to develop issues because it's not designed to hit those hits. Neither are you. Your emotional stasis is not designed to take the hits of trauma day in and day out, which means that you need to slow down. So when you get to that bad call, you get to that issue that you're struggling with, it's a critical incident, it's a discipline issue, it's a personal life issue, whatever it is, instead of going, ooh, this is bad, it's like, oh, this is a speed bump. Slow down and process. And in all honesty, it's not something that we do just not something that is normal for us. So it needs to become something that we do on a regular basis, so it becomes a habit. Even on the non-significant calls, you should take a few minutes after that call to just process through the emotional experience. Even if there really isn't an emotional experience, still just take through the steps. Because then when the bad call happens, you already have conditioned yourself to slow down and take yourself through the steps, right? And what are those steps? Processing our emotions. So the speed bumps of trauma, career path of a first responder is full of them. And so what do? Processing emotion means that we're learning to understand, make sense, and deal with the emotions as they're happening in a healthy way. So the first step is perspective, right? They're not right or not wrong. It's there. That's where that realism come in. It is what it is. This happened. And now is a part of who I am. Why? Because I experienced it. I saw that thing. It is in my head. It's a part of me now. So that first piece is going to be the perspective that is not right or wrong, but it's there. The second piece is going to be recognition, defining what that emotion is, defining what that feeling is, right? Giving it a name. I feel sad. I feel angry. I feel empty. I don't know how I feel, right? But put something, give that feeling a label, and then look at where the source is, identify that source. Why? Oftentimes we look at feelings as right or wrong. I shouldn't feel that way. If you feel that way, guess what? That's a feeling. It is there. The question is not right or wrong. The question is why? What is it about that call that's making me feel the way that I feel? And that's what we call a qualifier. So you show up at that scene of that incident, and that one thing that you can't get out of your head is going to be that qualifier. So we talked about bad calls, and it's like, oh, obviously a kid call, that's a bad call. That's going to impact somebody. Well, what about the 86-year-old male CPR call? Guys, that's my bread and butter. I mean, that is not an uncommon, unusual call. A critical incident, by definition, is an event that's above and beyond your normal range of experience. So we look at what our normal ranges of experiences are, right? It's pretty up there. But when you have that one experience, it's like, doesn't happen every day and it's really bad, that's going to be that critical incident. But I can tell you, I remember one night walking into an 86-year-old male CPR call. I'm walking up the stairs of the porch. The firefighter comes out the door, and he's got this big alligator tears running down his face. And he looks at me and he goes, man, chap, that guy looks just like my grandpa. Right? So you need to identify what is it, why? And oftentimes that qualifier is some form of an identification. In that particular firefighter's life, his grandpa is his hero. He's a firefighter because his grandpa was a firefighter. And his grandpa actually raised him as a kid. And in his world, his grandpa is immortal. But that guy that's laying in there that they just ceased efforts on looks just like him. And it crushed him to think about what if it was his grandpa, right? So we have to look at that and go, okay, why is that there? What's that qualifier? And then the fourth piece is going to be the acceptance piece. We spend so much of our emotional energy fighting the feeling and the emotion. I shouldn't feel this way. I can't operate if I'm feeling this way. I got to get that image out of my head or that sound out of my head, and I've got to do whatever I can. We struggle with this emotion, and guess what? We don't win that fight. We can't. We won't win that fight. We end up not sleeping because I can't sleep. Every time I close my eyes, I can't stop thinking about that. And I don't want to think about that because it hurts to go there. So I can't sleep. So we start to do things to numb ourselves. And that's where we get ourselves in trouble with alcohol, right? That's where we get ourselves in trouble with other addiction type issues because I'm just trying not to do this thing. So that acceptance piece, allowing yourself to experience the emotion, doing something with it. So when you look at the root word of emotions, energy and motion, they were never designed to be stuck. And yet that's our default setting, right? We have to allow those emotions to move through us. And it's going to hurt at the very beginning. The reason why we don't want to allow those emotions to go through us is because it does. It hurts the heart. And I don't want to feel that way. Stop. Right? But man, the back end of that pain is way worse. So if I hurt a little bit at the beginning of it and feel better, that's going to be worth it. But we don't like pain, right? So that's the reason why we stuff it. So what do we have to do? We have to guard our minds, right? So we talk about these control strategies. I love this cognitive control strategies. Thought stopping, cognitive reconstruction, positive affirmation, task relevant self-instruction. How do you get that thought out of your head that you can't stop thinking about? I remember one night I got home from children's. We had one of our firefighters, little baby, ended up on life support. And then they had to take the baby off life support. And it was just horrifically sad. 3 weeks old. It was terrible with respiratory issues. And they called and said, "This is what's going on." So I was literally kneeling on the floor with my arms around their shoulders, just sitting on the couch holding their little girl. They took her last breaths, right? It was terrible. But what an honor to be a witness and to be a part of that with that family and to be there with them. And I remember getting home and I was at the hospital for like 8 or 9 hours. And it's pretty late at night when I get home and I lay down to go to sleep. And guess what's in my head? Her lips. Couldn't get out of my head. Couldn't. And I'm laying there and I'm like, okay, I can't think about this. I don't want to think about this. This hurts, sucks, this sad. And I'm like, wait a second. Stop thinking about it this way. Right? Doing this. It's every now and then you like take your own advice. That was one of the times. I'm really glad I did. So thought stopping. Stop thinking about it this way. Cognitive reconstruction, it's just a fancy way of saying put it into a different perspective. So I started thinking about Abigail, because her name was Abigail. I said, you're a part of me now. This is the acceptance piece. You're a part of me now. You're a part of my experience. You're a part of my memories. Welcome to my head. A little scary up there. I'm really sorry about that, but welcome. I'm going to honor you by remembering you. I'm going to honor you with the memory that I have of you. And I've taken that memory and turned it now, right? From being a demon to being a place of honor, to honor her world. I couldn't change the situation. I couldn't heal her. I could just be there with them and now that she's a part of me. And then I woke up the next morning. I'm like, wow, that worked. Now I make it sound really easy. It's a little bit of a process, but it works, right? It's one of those things. It's cognitive control strategies, thought stopping, cognitive reconstruction, positive self-affirmations. I am good enough. It's okay that you're there. This is what I do and who I am, and it's good, right? Did you know that there's a whole scientific study on the power of positive self-affirmations? Somebody said to me one day, Pat, are you your own worst critic? I'm like, yeah, absolutely, right? I mean, that's part of who we are, what we do. And they said, you know, you can be your own best cheerleader. I rolled my eyes, I'm like, really seriously, that's stupid. Guess what? I Googled it. And there's an entire scientific study behind the power of positive action. I think I have that slide. Yeah, there we go. There's a whole scientific study behind the power of telling yourself you did a good job. And as dumb as that sounds, you can't believe the power behind that. You start telling yourself on a regular basis, I am good enough to do this. I do a good job. I am a great firefighter. I'm a good dad. I'm a good husband. And it actually will start changing your perspective on things. Perform better, feel more confident. Love this one. Lower air-related negativity. Right? Isn't that what we do on a regular basis? Positive self-affirmations affect our nervous system, our outlook on life, all of these types of things. So we go back to this positive self-affirmation, task relevant self-instruction. Do you know how I put that swimming pool together every summer that I hate so much? Stop thinking about the grandkids drowning in that pool. Start thinking about how much fun they're going to have. And you know what? I'm going to have fun in this pool too. My wife will let me in the pool with a Speedo on, but I'm going to have fun in that pool, right? I can do this. Task relevant self-instruction. It's amazing just that how much power is here. I mean, truly amazing how much power and how it's amazing how much energy we waste on fighting these things. When really, if we turn that energy to actually acceptance and letting it move through us, it really, really works. Transitioning from work to home is a big one when it comes to that, finding that emotional balance. When you're at work, you've got to be 100% emotionally invested in what you're doing. Is that not true? Absolutely. If you're going to do these jobs in first response, it takes 100% of who you are to do the job. But it also takes 100% of who you are to be at home too, right? And what we tend to do is we start taking work home with us. We take homework with us. Our identities begin to cross. And suddenly I am a firefighter. I am a dispatcher. I am a police officer. I am a chaplain. Wait a minute. No, that's not who I am. That's what I do. Why is it that we define ourselves who we are by what it is we do? Because it takes 100% of who we are to do what we do. And therefore it becomes a part of our identity. And one of the traps in that is when you can't do that thing anymore, now who are you? Because we've based our identity within our jobs. But again, it becomes 100% of who we do. So of who we are because of what we do. So what we have to be important is that when you go to work, be at work, engage, do the job, be 100% there, be the best first responder that you can possibly be. But when it's time to go home, you have to disengage from that. So you have to take a few minutes. I have a firefighter friend of mine talks about this, calls it launches and landings. And when he gets off shift, he purposely takes a few minutes to take a shower, sit down and have a cup of coffee in the beanery, think about his day for a few minutes, kind of disconnect from the job, and then he goes home. Right? He doesn't just walk out as soon as his shift is over and goes home and then tries to disconnect when he gets home, because that doesn't work. He's got kids and there's unmet expectations, things he has to do. So you have to have that time to process a little bit before you leave and then get home. And when you get there, engage. Here's what we do. We leave work, we disengage from work, we sit in what Dr. Gil Martin calls our magic chair to try to refill that emotional energy tank for the next couple of days, to try to get that energy back. And then we go back to work and re-engage in work. Well, guess what we forgot? We forgot to, when we disengaged from work, we didn't re-engage with home, right? It's vital. I have another friend of mine who just recently retired. When he goes to work, when he went to work, he would take his wedding ring off, put it in his locker, and for the next 24 hours, he was a firefighter. That's what he did. And then his shift was over, he put his wedding ring back on. And you know the shift, the time off firefighters get, right? You take a Kelly day, a shift trade, a vacation day, and you have 6 weeks off. So for the next 6 weeks, he was a husband and a dad, right? And that was a thing that he would do. And so sometimes having something like that reminds you, when you transition from work to home, take a few minutes to go, think about your day. Think about your shift. Think about the tough call. Think about all the different calls. What was good? What was not good? Kind of wash that system out, right? And then go home and be home. Because you will bring home to work with you. And you'll bring work home. You just have to do that in that balance. So we book into your shifts and being very purposeful, and you're re-engaging, disengaging. So kind of wrapping this thing up, here's what we talked about tonight. We defined what secondary traumatic stress is and how trauma and grief impact and deplete and throw our emotional system out of balance, right? We're immersed in society's trauma. We're shareholders in society's grief. We have ownership in society's grief, and it impacts our world. And that's what secondary traumatic stress is. When somebody else's trauma begins to impact my life. Trauma is powerful enough that it literally can change your memory storage processing. And trauma, no matter how significant or insignificant it is, when you witness somebody else's trauma, it will touch you and it will leave a mark. It will impact your world. You might not feel it right now, but it goes into that bucket. And we carry that bucket everywhere we go because that bucket is our experience. And if you've experienced it, it's a part of who you are. Your memories don't have to become your demons. They're memories. So we've talked about resiliency, purposeful emotional self-care, the attitude of realism, managing your expectations, right? Processing, guarding your mind. All of these things are extremely important to maintaining. And here's the key to it all. Purposeful action. Don't wait until you have to do this because that thing happened. Resiliency is not about being tough at the moment. Resiliency is about being prepared so when it happens, you can bounce back that much faster. It's going to happen. It's going to happen. And so if you're prepared for it, which means every day you're doing something in your world to make your world a better place. It doesn't mean your world is bad. You're still doing something to make your world a better place. Every night, I've made it a habit. Every night when I go home and I lay down to go to sleep, I take a few minutes and it's not a long time. I don't like spend an hour. I don't journal. I just have a thought. What was good about my day today? What was one thing that was good that I can think about for just a minute? Because my world is full of violence and trauma and death and dying and grief, right? I mean, that's all the stuff that I deal with on a regular basis. And man, out of the overflow of the heart, the mouth speaks. That's what I'm putting in. So I have to find things. I have to take some time to think on something that is pure and lovely and just. And I have to think on that and let that become a part of what's inside my heart. That's a purposeful habit that I've made. And it's just one of those things, right? So what the important thing is that you do you. It's mountain biking for me. That's the thing that energizes me. So guess what? I'm going to get out there and I'm going to do that. If it's underwater basket weaving for you, then put some swimming trunks on and go for it, right? If it's journaling, if it's yoga, if it's going on long walks on the beach, then by all means, go do those things. You have to be purposeful in taking care of you and making sure that that attitude, that perspective, and that mindset is there and that you're being purposeful. Because when you have a sense of purpose, it increases your optimism, your resiliency, and your hope, right? Your hope. Questions, thoughts, concerns about anything we've talked about tonight in this class? Anything at all? Well, that means I've done a really good job. You're like, seriously, it is like 8 o'clock. Please
Well,
stop.
I do want to say, I liked the idea and the suggestion to make it normal that people go to, like, you go to the dentist twice a year, you go to the doctor once a year, to kind of get rid of the stigma of asking for help and just going for a checkup
Yeah.
once a year. You know what I mean? Just utilizing
Right.
their insurance covers it or EAP or whatever.
Yeah, insurance pays for it. Why not?
I think
Right?
that might help get rid of the stigma
Yeah.
of people asking
It's
for
a good
help.
part of
It's becoming normal.
I'm a normal thing. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
And Pat, let me reach out to those online. Is there anybody online that would like to ask Pat a question or make a comment? Just open your mic and you can.
That or
We
type
can
in
hear
a
you.
question.
Yeah, or
While you're
type it in
doing
the
that, you got
chat.
something you wanted to,
Yeah.
were you used to scratch your head? You gotta be careful when I'm doing class and you scratch your head, I'm gonna call on you. So,
Oh, me?
yeah. were you-
Oh.
So the question is, how do you prepare for the unexpected? I mean, what the next big, whatever's gonna happen, 9/11 or?
Right, exactly. So that's where that making it a habit comes in, right? So even on the insignificant calls, you take a few moments and do process through that call. Even if it was insignificant, it was not that big of a deal, it didn't affect you. Still take a few minutes to go, why do I feel, what do I feel? Why do I feel that way? What's happening? Because when that really horrific call comes,
Right,
it's already habit to do that. How do you prepare for the really unexpected? Well, how do you prepare for any unexpected? I mean, every call you go on is unexpected.
right.
I mean, seriously, can you tell me what the next 911 call is you're gonna respond to? Nope.
No, okay.
It's the same principle, right?
Right.
But that's why we also have the interventions that we have, like the group crisis intervention, like the debriefings and those kind of things. we do those things on those big type events, because you can't take away the unexpected. It's just going to happen.
Right, you can't worry about what is
No,
there. Yeah.
No, but if I can do my job to the best of my ability with the tools and training and everything that I have, then I've done my job, whether it's significant or insignificant, right? Yeah. Anybody online have anything?
I'm not seeing anybody have on, questions online,
Cool.
just pop your mic open or raise a hand.
So obviously my contact information here, I have business cards. I don't know where I put them. I think I put them on.
They're right here, actually.
Oh, they're right there on the table. Feel free to grab one. If there's anything I can ever do to support you, or you have questions, or have anything you ever want to say, I'm a phone call away, an email away. Honestly, be happy to chat with you about any of this. So that's it. I'm done. That's all I got. Thanks, you guys.
Thanks so much for making the drive up.
Oh,
Yeah, that's good to see you.
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, Pat drove up from Kent. It's a long ride home.
Flowers.
Extremely,
I'm gonna
deeply
stop,
grateful.
get myself a little bit of caffeine.
Yeah, so.
Yeah, good old gas station coffee.
Please do. If I see you on the final day. That's always like a big.
Thank you.
Ready?